by the gentle Danube River, in a small village named St. Florian in the Austrian countryside, an old man lived alone in a weathered wooden house. His hair was as white as winter snow, and his clouded eyes held memories of a distant past. Each morning, beneath the ancient oak tree in front of his home, he sat quietly with a cup of hot tea, conversing with a tiny sparrow, an unexpected companion in the twilight of his life. From their simple whispers, a magical friendship blossomed between man and nature, leaving an everlasting mark on the peaceful village. This is the story of Hans, the sparrow, and the beautiful things that once seemed possible only in fairy tales. Chapter 1: The Meeting Under the Oak Tree. In a small village by the Danube River, nestled in the Austrian countryside, an old man named Hans lived in a weathered wooden house. The village, called St. Florian, was a picturesque place where red-roofed houses sat amid golden wheat fields and lush green hills. Hans was 83 years old, his hair as white as snow, and though his eyes had grown cloudy with age, they still held a mischievous glimmer from his youth. His wife had passed away more than 20 years ago, and his 2 sons had left for Vienna to build their own lives. Though he lived alone, he never felt lonely, for his small garden and the whispering wine through the trees were his daily companions. That morning, like every morning, Hans carried a cup of hot tea to the wooden bench beneath the ancient oak tree in front of his house. The oak had stood there for hundreds of years, its gnarled trunk and lush canopy providing shade to a corner of the garden. He sat down, inhaling the crisp morning air, and listened to the cheerful chirping of birds on the hillside. Suddenly, a small sparrow with grayish-brown feathers speckled with white fluttered down, perching on the lowest branch just a few steps away. The little bird showed no fear, its round eyes gazing at the old man as if trying to strike up a conversation. "Good morning, little friend," Hans said warmly. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" The sparrow tilted its head and chirped a short melody, as if replying. Hans smiled, the wrinkles on his face softening. He didn't think much of it, only that he felt a quiet joy at the unexpected visit. From that day on, the sparrow returned each morning, and Hans grew accustomed to its presence. Chapter 2: Stories Over Tea. Day by day, Hans and the sparrow became an unusual pair of friends. Every morning, he would bring his tea to the wooden bench, while the sparrow perched on the oak tree, sometimes hopping down to peck at the breadcrumbs Hans scattered from his leftover bread. Hans began to tell stories, as if the little bird could truly understand him. He spoke of the days of his youth when he was a strong young man, rowing boats along the Danube to transport goods for the village. "Back then, the river was so blue," he reminisced, his gaze drifting into the past. "I used to sing Austrian folk songs, my voice echoing along the river. The girls loved to hear me sing, especially my wife, back when she was young." The sparrow flapped its wings lightly and chirped a few notes, as if in agreement, making Hans chuckle. On some days he told tales of village festivals under the moonlight, when people would gather around bonfires, dancing to traditional waltz melodies. "I wasn't a bad dancer, you know," he said, tapping his fingers as if keeping rhythm. "And she, my wife, was always the first to dance with me." The sparrow tilted its head and gently pecked at the branch, as if eager to hear more. Soon, the villagers began to notice Hans's new habit. A little girl named Anna, the baker's daughter, often passed by and saw the old man talking to the bird. "What is Mr. Hans telling the sparrow?" she asked curiously one day. Hans chuckled kindly. "Oh, my dear, I'm just telling it the story of my life. It's a good friend, you see." Anna giggled and ran off to tell her mother, and before long, the tale of the old man and the sparrow spread throughout the village. Chapter 3: A Quiet Loneliness. Autumn arrived, and the oak tree's leaves turned golden, drifting gently down into the garden. One crisp morning, Hans sat beneath the tree, holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold. That day, he did not tell cheerful stories as he usually did. His voice was lower, tinged with quiet melancholy. "I am old now, little one," he murmured. "There is no one left beside me. My children are busy in the city, only visiting a few times a year. And me, I have only the trees and the cold wind to talk to." The little sparrow seemed to sense his sadness. It fluttered down and perched right on his hand, pecking lightly at his thin fingers as if offering comfort. Hans was surprised, then let out a soft chuckle, his wrinkled eyes lighting up with a small joy. "Thank you, little friend," he whispered. "You are the best companion I have in these days." From that day on, the sparrow stayed closer to him, not only perching on the oak tree but sometimes resting on his shoulder or beside his cup of tea. The villagers began to whisper among themselves. Franz, the blacksmith, shook his head and said that Hans had grown senile, talking to birds like a child. But Maria, the florist at the village market, only smiled. "He has found joy in nature," she said. "What is wrong with that?" Chapter 4: The Bitter Winter. Winter arrived, blanketing the village of St. Florian in a thick layer of snow. The Danube partially froze, and the cold wind whistled through the rooftops. Hans no longer went outside as often, his health was weakening. But every morning, he still made an effort to put on a thick wool sweater and a fur hat, sitting under the oak tree for a few minutes just to see the little sparrow. One day, he spoke softly to the bird. "This winter is too cold, little one. I don't think I can hold on much longer." The sparrow chirped a few short notes, as if trying to encourage him. Hans chuckled, his breath turning into white mist in the freezing air. Then, one morning, as heavy snow fell, Hans did not appear. The sparrow flew to the oak tree, perching on its lowest branch, waiting. But the wooden bench remained empty, and the house was silent. The next day came, and the day after that, still, there was no sign of the old man. Worried, little Anna ran to his house and knocked on the door, but no one answered. The villagers gathered and finally entered, only to find that Hans had passed away in his sleep. His face was peaceful, as if dreaming of days long past. Chapter 5: A Song Beneath the Oak. After Hans's passing, the village of St. Florian felt quieter. His wooden house remained, kept by his sons, but no one lived there. Under the oak tree, the little sparrow still returned every morning, perching on the lowest branch and singing its cheerful tune, as if calling for its old friend. The villagers began to believe that the sparrow was mourning Hans. Little Anna often brought crumbs of bread, scattering them beneath the tree. "Little bird," she would say, "Mr. Hans has gone to heaven. But I'm sure he can still hear you sing." The sparrow tilted its head, pecked at the crumbs, and continued its song. As time passed, the story of the old man and the sparrow became a small legend in the village. Every winter, a sparrow, or perhaps its descendants, could still be seen under the oak tree, singing joyful melodies amidst the falling snow. And in those songs, the villagers swore they could still hear the faint echoes of Hans's raspy laughter, the laughter of a man who had found comfort in the simplest, most beautiful companionship of nature. Chapter 6: A Letter from Vienna. After Hans's passing, the village of St. Florian seemed to have lost a part of its soul. His wooden house still stood, its windows covered in dust, and his small gardens slowly became overgrown beneath the thick snow. Yet, the little sparrow continued to visit the oak tree every day, as if it were an unchanging ritual. The villagers grew accustomed to this sight, and the story of the old man and the sparrow became a shared memory among them. One winter afternoon, as the rare sunlight pierced through the gray clouds, a sleek black car appeared on the muddy village road. It was Karl, Hans's eldest son, returning from Vienna. Tall and dressed in a formal suit, Karl bore the weary look of a city man. He stepped into the wooden house, carrying a small suitcase and a yellowed envelope. Karl sat down at the old wooden table in the kitchen, where his father used to make tea every morning. He opened the envelope. It was a letter his father had written to him months ago, but never had the chance to send. As he read the trembling handwriting, Karl fell silent. "My dear Karl, I am old now and do not have much time left. I do not blame you for being busy, but I hope that one day you will return to visit the village. Here I have a little friend, a sparrow. It comes every morning to listen to my stories. Would you believe me if I said that sometimes I feel like it understands me better than people do? If I am gone, please take care of the garden for me, so that my little friend still has a place to visit." Karl folded the letter, his eyes turning red. He had never imagined that his father had been so lonely, nor that a tiny sparrow had become his greatest comfort in his final days. He stepped outside into the garden, looked up at the old oak tree, and whispered, "Father, I'm sorry." Chapter 7. A New Friend Under the Oak Tree. Carl decided to stay in St. Florian for a few days to clean up the house and reflect on what his father had left behind. He wasn't used to the quiet of the countryside, where there were no blaring car horns or the relentless pace of Vienna. But the next morning, as he took a cup of coffee outside and sat beneath the oak tree, the little sparrow appeared. It perched on a low branch, gazing at him with curious eyes. "Hello there," Carl said hesitantly. "My father mentioned you in his letter. You were his friend, weren't you?" The sparrow tilted its head, chirped a few short notes, then fluttered down to peck at the crumbs Anna had left the day before. Carl smiled. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of lightness in his heart. He began talking to the sparrow, just as his father once did. He spoke of life in Vienna, the stress of working at a bank, and the days he had forgotten about his hometown. From that day on, every morning, Carl sat under the oak tree. He wasn't as skilled at storytelling as Hans, but the little sparrow remained, patiently listening. Anna, the neighbor's daughter, started to notice. One day, she ran over, holding a handful of chestnuts. "Uncle Carl, are you talking to the sparrow like Mr. Hans used to?" Carl gave her a gentle smile. "Yes, I suppose I learned it from him. It's a special friend, isn't it?" Anna nodded, then scattered the chestnuts on the ground. "I think Mr. Hans is still here somehow, through this little bird." Chapter 8. Reviving the Garden. After a few days in the village, Carl realized he no longer wanted to sell the wooden house as he had originally planned. His father's letter and the quiet mornings spent talking to the little sparrow had changed him. He took an extended leave from work and decided to stay in St. Florian to restore Hans' garden. He wanted to fulfill his father's wish, to keep this place alive so that his small feathered friend would always have a home. Carl got to work, though he was clumsy, having never tended a garden before. He pulled out weeds, pruned dry branches, and replanted the flowers his mother had once loved, carnations and lavender. The villagers were surprised to see a city man in work clothes, hands covered in soil. Maria, the florist, brought over a few seedlings and taught him how to care for them. Franz, the blacksmith, lent him tools and laughed heartily. "You look just like young Hans back in the day." Each morning, the little sparrow returned, perching on the oak tree, watching Carl work. Sometimes, it fluttered down to peck at the seeds Carl scattered, as if encouraging him to keep going. Slowly, Carl began to understand the peace his father had found, a connection with nature, with the simple things he had long neglected in the city. Chapter 9. A Festival Under the Moonlight. Spring arrived, and Hans' garden bloomed beautifully. The flower beds were vibrant, and the old oak tree was lush with fresh green leaves. To thank the villagers for their help, Carl decided to host a small gathering beneath the oak tree, just like the festivals his father had once spoken of. That night, the moon cast its silvery glow over St. Florian. The villagers gathered around a bonfire, dancing to the traditional waltz. Anna pulled Carl into the crowd, insisting he join, even though he clumsily tripped over his own feet a few times. Laughter rang out, blending with the melodies of Franz's accordion. The little sparrow perched on the oak tree, chirping cheerfully as if joining in the celebration. As the night grew late, Carl sat alone beneath the oak tree, gazing up at the moon. He whispered, "Father, I did it. I hope you're happy." The little sparrow fluttered down, landing gently on his shoulder, pecking lightly at his hair as if in response. Carl smiled, feeling his father's presence still lingering, somewhere in the bird's song, in the rustling leaves, in the wind that whispered through the night.